The diameters of the planets in the ancient Surya Siddhanta.
Hello there. Before we get into the subject of this video, I just wanted to mention the exciting book I've just had published. Exploring Puranic Visions of the Universe. Using accessible language and helpful images, I summarise both historical and recent efforts to reconcile our universe, as described in the ancient Puranas, with the modern understanding. Before the birth of modern science, Vedic astronomers were explaining astronomical phenomena using advanced mathematical techniques. Order the book from Amazon now. So let's get into the subject of this video. The diameters of the planets in the ancient Surya Siddhanta.
Encoded within this Indian astronomical text are formulas for calculating the diameters of the planets in our solar system. The results agree surprisingly well with modern figures. Before I explain that, consider the following. Verse 159 of the Surya Siddhanta gives the diameter of the Earth globe as 1,600 yojanas. At the accepted 5 miles per yojana, that brings the Earth's diameter to 8,000 miles, similar to the modern size. Verse 4.1 of the Surya Siddhanta gives the diameters of the Sun and Moon in yojanas. The resulting Moon's diameter is 2,400 miles, about 11% higher than the modern value. The corresponding Earth-Moon distance of about 258,000 miles is further than the modern by just 8.3%. Impressive. It's easy to see why the diameter of the Moon would be reasonably accurate. The dimensions of the Moon and its orbit were well known in ancient times. However, the Sun's diameter in the Surya Siddhanta comes to 32,500 miles, which is very small compared to the modern version. Ancient astronomers tended to greatly underestimate the Earth-Sun distance, and this also seems to have influenced the Surya Siddhanta. But it must be noted that in the 5th canto of the Bhagavad Purana, the distance between the Earth and the Sun within the circular plane of Bhutan-mandala is strikingly consistent with modern figures. The average distance of the concentric circle band that the Sun is in comes to 93.24 million miles. Now, let's consider the diameters of the planets up to Saturn. Chapter 7.13 of the Surya Siddhanta gives the following rule. The diameter upon the Moon's orbit of Mars, Saturn, Mercury and Jupiter are declared to be 30, increased successively by half the half. That of Venus is 60. Upon the Moon's orbit means how the planets look from Earth as though they were located at the distance of the Moon. Half the half of 30 is 7.5. Thus the verse says that the diameters upon the Moon's orbit are given 30, 37.5, 45, 52.5 and 60 yojanas for the planets respectively. Before I go on, I need to define a couple of things. An angular diameter, or a reduced diameter, is a unit describing how large a sphere or circle appears from a given point of view. In this context, it's the Earth. A minute of arc is a unit of measurement which is 1/60th of a degree of a complete circle. A complete circle is 360 degrees, so a minute will be a circle divided by 360, then divided by another 60. The Surya Siddhanta says there are 15 yojanas per minute of arc at the distance of the Moon. With that information, the angular diameters of planets can be calculated. Results of the planets are listed in this table. As well as the angular diameters in the Surya Siddhanta listed down the left column there, the table also shows measurements by the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, those by the 2nd century Alexandrian astronomer Claudius Ptolemy, and the Indian astronomer Aryabhata. The two columns on the right are figures provided in modern astronomy. Note that the Surya Siddhanta's angular diameters are roughly the same size as those of Claudius Ptolemy, but in Ptolemy's planetary hypothesis he wildly underestimated the diameters and distances of the planets from the Earth. Brahe's figures were obtained by sighting through pinholes using the naked eye. Such methods were not at all accurate. They simply measure a blob of planetary light generated by the poor optics of the human eye. However, the angular diameters in the Surya Siddhanta have an important property that the other ancient texts lack. To see this, it is first necessary to skip to its 12th chapter. Verses 85 to 90 in that chapter give the circumferences of the planetary orbits, with Earth placed at the centre. Those figures are reproduced in this table, accompanied by the calculated average distance from the Earth in miles. For Mercury and Venus, their average orbital periods are the same as the Sun. Seems odd to us, but to see what the Surya Siddhanta says about the diameters of the planets, we should multiply the orbital radii in chapter 12 by its angular diameters in chapter 7. Basically, it requires a bit of trigonometry here. The results are listed in miles in this table. The so-called error percentages show the difference between the Surya Siddhanta's diameters and the corresponding modern planetary diameters. Note that the diameters are close to modern values for Mercury, Mars and Saturn. For Venus and Jupiter, they are too small by about 50%. One explanation is that their radii were listed in verse 713 instead of their diameters. That may have been in order to allow for a mathematical rule intended as a memory aid. In those days, brevity was considered a virtue. Anyway, if we turn radii into diameters by multiplying the figures by 2, we get 83,248 miles for Jupiter and 8,022 miles for Venus. In that case, all 5 planets differ only 11% or less from the modern diameters. Dr. Richard Thompson, Sadhaputta Das, conducted a probability calculation about that. The running of 20,000 random trials of angular diameters as if the observer only had the naked eye to make realistic estimations. Sadhaputta calculated that the probability of being as close to modern figures as the Surya Siddhanta simply by chance reaches only 2 to 3%. And if you make that radii allowance for Jupiter and Venus, it is only 0.4% chance. So the information in the Surya Siddhanta surely must be due to design. One obvious hypothesis is that at some point in the distant past, ancient astronomers possessed realistic values for the diameters of the planets. They might have acquired this knowledge during a forgotten period in which astronomy reached a high level of sophistication. Later on, much of this knowledge was lost, but fragmentary remnants were preserved and eventually incorporated into text such as the Surya Siddhanta. In particular, the real diameters of the planets were later combined with erroneous orbital circumferences to compute the diameters. Another possible explanation is that the verse 713 may have been written recently using modern data and dishonestly slipped into the text. But this is ruled out by the fact there is a manuscript of the Surya Siddhanta that is dated to the year 1431. The manuscript includes a commentary on that verse by Pamaneshwar, who died in 1450. and thus it definitely dates back to the 15th century. It is clear that the information on planetary diameters in the Surya Siddhanta predates the development of modern knowledge of those diameters. It is also clear that ancient Greek astronomers did not have such accurate knowledge. This indicates that such knowledge was possessed by ancient astronomers and recorded in the Surya Siddhanta or some other earlier astronomical text. It is not clear exactly how such knowledge may have been obtained. The existence of ancient telescopes springs to mind, but we should be on the alert for other possible examples. Some might point out to the opening verses to the Surya Siddhanta itself. It explains it was first spoken by the sun god's charioteer to the Asura Mayadanava back in the Satya Yuga, said to be a time of mystical and spiritual advancement. Using the traditional interpretation of the Puranic time, that would have been around 2 million Earth years ago. Even if you use smaller numbers for the Yuga periods, it is still equal to many thousands of years ago. Something to think about. Thanks for watching.